All right, guys. So welcome to this, I guess, the third week of classes, and we're going to be looking at chapter. Let's bring this up so I can see if anybody comes up with questions. We're going to be looking at chapter 2 of the Exploring Leadership textbook. And have anybody or has anybody been able to go through this chapter on their own from the e-classroom?
I skimmed. It was quite long.
They think this one's long. Next
Yeah.
week's going to be even longer. All right. And I did say to you the reason why it's longer is because I'm not leaving anything out and I'm putting in a lot of detail because it's a standalone presentation. It's not meant for a presentation, okay? So as we go through it now, what we're going to find is that I'm not going to focus on all the elements of it, but I'm going to be looking at key issues that bring themselves up in terms of the gist of what the presentation is about. So the last class, we sort of just had an introduction and overview to the whole thing. And now we're going to be looking at a little more detailed. So in this class, or this chapter, it attempted to try to look at the evolution of leadership and leadership studies in the context of the modern environment and look at the various theories that were developed over periods of time to try to give some sort of explanation for leadership. So let's start by looking at the first thing it tries to do. It tried to look at how leadership is perceived today. And one of the perceptions that's often connected with leadership is the fact that most times people look at leadership, gaining positions of leadership as a prize. You want to become the CEO of a company, or you want to become the manager of an organization or a department or something along those lines. Now, that's one thing. So some people, I should say, not everybody, look towards leadership positions as some sort of reward to be had. And for those people who operate with leaders, what they find is that some people will work well with leaders and some people just can't stand them. And the general observation that's been made is that leadership is one of those phenomenons that has been observed a lot, but is least understood in terms of theory and understanding. So the concepts that we're going to be looking at here is the attempts that have been made to try to understand this overall concept of leadership. So it's been, as I said, it's been written about, it's been spoken about and postulated about the whole thing from a wide range of different points of view. So for example, some of you all might be familiar with these textbooks here, or these logos here. For example, we're using this textbook here, the Leadership Experience by Daft. I have worked specifically, I've done training with the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I've done that one. I also did another leadership program called the Leadership Challenge. I can't remember who that author was. I've looked at elements of the Tony Robbins programs that he goes through in his motivational speaking. And I'm sure there are a host of other different programs that exist outside there that people should be aware of, and especially if you're active in church activities, especially the open gospel type churches, there are lots of different of evangelical people who end up moving or going to the area of leadership in the context of religion. In fact, most religions have some form of leadership training that they put their people through to be able to, lead the congregation through the examination of faith. So the leadership is applied in different circumstances, but the vast majority of leadership programs that exist outside there tend to be focused on business activities. So a lot of times when we're looking at leadership programs, they are going to be connected to some sort of business experience or the impact that is likely to have on business. So because of the flexibility of leadership, it is a problem to arrive at a single definition of what leadership is about, because it operates in so many different environments or contexts that it means different things to different people. So therefore, it's going to be impacted upon by the context in which it's practiced, as well as the places in which they're practiced. So leadership is therefore something that has varied approaches and varied impressions or perceptions of the concepts outside there. So we are going to be looking at it from a different angle from the program that we're going to be looking at. Now, most times when we're looking at leadership, we are looking at leaders to provide solutions for problems that we face. And the problems that we face are numerous. I just listed a few here: climate change, globalization, poverty, healthcare, education, public services. Those are some that I have identified. What, if any, can you think of that might be missing from this list? Anybody can make a suggestion? You're hearing me, right?
So would agriculture be one?
Yes, agriculture could be one. How would we be, how would we caption that so that it kind of is a little bit wider in its scope rather than so focused on agriculture alone? It's a term that's utilized it was utilized in the last budget, actually. I mean, how many of you all pay attention to the last budget presentation that took place on Monday? No? All right, so when we refer to agriculture, what we're talking about there is food security. Making sense?
So I was going to say food sustainability, but yeah, food
That too,
security
yeah,
makes
yeah.
more sense.
Different way for a different thing. Another thing that comes to mind and that has been mentioned in other classes is crime or issues of national security. Those are things that would come to mind. So that's something, for instance, that Devanand could have probably brought up in relation to the context of his studies. So the problem that we do face is that when we don't get the kind of responses we're looking for, we don't see solutions to the problems that we face, we are going to start to feel disappointed in people. And the more they disappoint us, or the more times that leadership tends to disappoint us, what ends up happening is that we start to distrust people who are in leadership positions. And that experience or that history that we have with people in leadership positions, doesn't matter who it is, it might be different people over time, but we seem to be getting the same results. We tend to start to create a lot of distrust, and it creates a kind of anti-leadership virus rather than a vaccine, but an anti-leadership virus, because what it starts to do, it starts to infect people who are likely to be good leaders. And it starts to create a situation where those people who would make good leaders choose not to participate in leadership activities or put themselves up for leadership positions because they're unwilling to deal with the fallout of the current attitudes that we have towards leadership. As a result, very often we end up with people in leadership positions who are 9 times out of 10, they're not well prepared for the positions that they hold. And that means we're stuck in this never-ending cycle of putting people who make themselves available, but who are not necessarily qualified to be there nor capable of being there. And therefore, they're going to fail us or disappoint us. And that's going to create this never-ending cycle of disappointment and further anti-leader distrust that is going to create this feeling. And it's a sort of very problematic situation because it's going to continue creating that level unwillingness in people to take up leadership positions. How many of you all feel that way in terms of, you know, you don't see any kind of rewards at being in a leadership position because of the kind of negativity attached to it, especially if we think about leadership from a political experience. Most people say that you know, in order to be active in politics here, you have to have thick skin. You can't afford to be too sensitive because people are going to find the worst things to say about you regardless. That's true of any leadership position, by the way, because once you put yourself up to public scrutiny within whatever organization you're working with, you're going to come across people who will not trust you, not necessarily because of what you did, but what happened in the past. And also, you're going to find that you're going to have to deal with the fallout from previous leadership that has affected people's point of view of things. So this is an important thing for us to remember, that we have a situation where leadership is not something that is trusted by everybody. They're very untrustworthy. Now, current research provides some insight into the myths of leadership. So let's look at what some of the old myths are, or what are some of the myths involved with thinking about leadership here. So we have leaders are born, not made. That's a topic you all will be debating. Leadership is hierarchical, and you need to hold a formal position, have status and power to be considered a leader. You have to have charisma to be an effective leader. There is one way of leading, and that's the right way. Every other way is wrong. And it's impossible for you to be a manager and a leader at the same time. And you only need to have common sense to be an effective leader. So let's look at what the truths are that this model that we're going to be looking at is going to talk about. First and foremost is that leaders are made, not born. So a lot of people believe that, and again, as I said, you all will be debating this topic in more detail later on. Or this is one of the topics that you can debate, I should say. So leaders are not born with innate characteristics that make them leaders. Though we tend to say that we see people, children in the playground, coming up with behaviors that immediately put them in positions of leadership, or they tend to naturally find themselves being leaders in organizations. And the reality is that though you may have some predisposition to it, it doesn't mean that you can't develop the skills necessary to be a leader after the fact. And that's what this model is going to say. This model says that leadership is a number of skills and attitudes that you can develop over time. All right. Otherwise, this course wouldn't exist if that's the case. All right. The other thing about leadership being very specific in terms of its occurrence is also not true, because leadership takes place in different levels of different organizations. Leadership also takes place in homes, and it doesn't necessarily only fall upon parents to lead. In progressive organizations, we have leadership being shared among different people within the organization, especially if you are working in circumstances where you have teams that are working on different activities or projects in an organization. You're going to find that leadership is something that is shared among different people throughout the organization. And that's something that means that you don't necessarily need to be in a formal status. You can arrive at being a leader based upon other factors. In fact, there's a chapter presentation about power and influence that deals with how leadership and how you get power and sources of power and so on, and that type of stuff. If you've done organizational behavior, you would have come across some of this before. But the idea of leadership occurring only at particular levels in an organization is not true. It occurs at all levels. If you think about where you are in your own organization, you may be exhibiting leadership behavior already in your subordinate roles, even if it's just leading yourself in terms of being proactive and anticipating what is necessary to be done in the organization. Charisma is not a prerequisite for leadership. So the theory here is going to speak to charisma as not a necessary tool for good leadership and effective leadership. It's also going to point to the problems that past charismatic leaders have created because of the nature of what charisma is. Now, charisma is a sort of undefinable characteristic of an individual that leaves or creates an emotional response in individuals who are around them. And because of the nature of this being emotional in nature, it is very dangerous, especially if leaders are unable to curb their baser instincts and take advantage of the situation. So much so that Drucker, if you are familiar with management theory, Drucker is one of those individuals who writes a lot about management and leadership, spoke about the three most charismatic leaders in the last century were those individuals who inflicted the most amount of suffering in the world around us. And he identified Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. Now, Hitler would have been in the context of World War II, Stalin in the context of the development of the Soviet Union, and Mao is associated with the development of the Chinese Revolution, the Communist Revolution in China, and what is referred to as the Great Leap Forward. You all are familiar with what took place with all of these individuals, right? But there are other individuals who we could look to. So for example, well, I have Hitler here, so we spoke about him, but we have other charismatic individuals. And out of these four here, two of them are extremely negative. And interestingly enough, the two who are positive, Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, both of them were assassinated. So that's something else. Emotional responses to individuals can also lead to negative emotional responses. Does anybody recognize the gentleman with the shades?
No, sir. I can't say that I can.
No? All right, so that gentleman with the shades is the Right Reverend Jones. Jim Jones. Make sense now? Does it ring a bell? Jonestown Massacre. The suicides in Jonestown, Guyana. Ring a bell?
Suicide pact.
Yep. Yeah. He's one of a number of cult leaders who developed this sort of cult following that then led to mass suicides and a great loss of life. Again, speaking to their charisma. So they utilize their charisma to be able to influence people to do things they wouldn't normally do. And as a result of that level of influence, it created problems in the past. We'll come back to charisma in a number of different issues. Now, I'm not saying that charisma is not a useful thing, as you can see in terms of these two leaders here. They used their charisma to work on visions that were positive, but far too often, charismatic individuals sometimes have nefarious goals in mind. So that's something that you want to pay attention to. All right, so coming to the other myth about doing, there's only one way to manage. What we're going to learn is that because of the different situations we're going to find ourselves in, excuse me, we're going to find that there is no one right way to do any kind of leadership. Different circumstances, situations, and even different individuals who get involved with leadership are going to behave differently, and they're going to lead utilizing different techniques. So there's no right way, one right way. There are different combinations, and the model that we're going to look at is also going to indicate to you that for every circumstance or different circumstances will call for different types of leadership techniques to be utilized. So there's no one right way. All right. Distinguishing between management and leadership. So when we talk about managing, we're usually talking about this in the context of business activities. So management is about managing resources in an organization to get the most returns. Whereas leadership is not about managing resources, which include humans or labor, as the case might be, but it includes motivating, stimulating, and encouraging people to be better than they think they are. So the issue is really going to be, can you lead both? And the answer is yes, you can both be a manager and a leader simultaneously. Because based upon the techniques that you're utilizing in terms of operating as a manager, you're going to find that elements of your leadership potential show up in it. And it's important for us to remember that because the activities of managers are closely aligned to organizational goals, then what you're going to find is that inside the actions or the activities that you're going to utilize for getting to the organizational goals, you're going to have to use some sort of leadership potential to be able to get people to do things the the way they ought to be done. So I like this distinction that Zelenics uses here. Managers are preoccupied with doing things the right way, whereas leaders are focused on doing the right thing. So again, because management is looking at outcomes to suit the organizational requirements, sales, turnover, that type of stuff, leaders are more focused on, or should be more focused, you should say, on making sure that what we're doing is the best thing for everybody concerned. So if we are operating in a business environment, are we producing goods that are benefit to the country, to the environment? Are we doing things that are useful in the long run, or are they painful or destructive in the long run? Those are the kind of criteria that we're going to be looking at in relation to differentiating between management activities and leadership activities. So we can look at that from that perspective as well. All right, um, so again, they go on talking about the distinction, so we don't need to harp on this because I think we've understood the basic organizational differences between leadership and management, and the fact that we can be both, probably with a mix of the two taking on different roles. And again, it's about mixing your skills, or being able to develop the skills to be able to move between one of the function and the other, because they tend to overlap with each other at time. All right, so this brings us to the teachable nature of leadership. And again, very simply, if what's the purpose of having this class if leadership is not something that we expect can be learned by people? Now, again, people are going to say you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. But at the same time, what we're talking about is teaching people about the various skills, attitudes, techniques that can be utilized to be able to become better and more effective leaders. And it's not only about using your common sense, though common sense is important. It's about being able to use different sort of analytical tools to be able to develop your skills as a leader. All right. So those are some of the things like process involving. So leadership is a process involving preparation, experience, trial and error, self-examination, and a willingness to learn from mistakes as well as your successes. So those are things that we will start to look at in more detail in the program that we're looking at. All right, so how do we define a leader? So the term leader can be traced in the English language to being first used in about the 1300s. That's the word leader. And the word leadership actually emerged in the English language in the early 1800s, or 17 something. Generally, however, it was utilized in the context of political influence. It's had to do with kings and queens and people in that leadership ilk in a the political nature, which will also include the church at this particular time, because remember, during this period, the church has played a very pivotal role in leading countries around the world. All right, so formal definitions of leadership existed or began to be formulated from the late 1800s, the beginning of the 19th century, moving forward up to 1929. That's where some of the definitions that are coming up. So in the 80s, we had more definitions, and of course, what happens is as you begin to look at a phenomenon more and more development and more definitions are going to take place. Generally, though, these definitions are going to be created in the field of academic studies. So this is where we're going to be able to look at it. So one of the early definitions by Mumford in 1906 defined leadership as the preeminence of one or a few individuals in a group in the process of control of societal phenomena. So whenever I think of this or see this definition, I always think of a master of puppets, because in this case here, you're talking about one person influencing other people. So this kind of master of puppets idea is one that is a little nefarious, because it always speaks to somebody who's behind the scenes pulling strings. So it's quite I don't think it's a good definition, because it really smacks of somebody making you do things you don't necessarily want to do, and you are controlling people, which is a definition that tends to to come with people who don't trust leadership. They tend to have this vision of what leadership is all about. But again, this is an early definition, and we have better definitions or modern definitions. Doesn't mean that some leaders don't pretend to try to want to control people. All right. Newer definitions or contemporary definitions really try to look at leadership as a process of relationships between people based on mutual goals. That's we're working together to accomplish something that is something that we agree to, we have consensus on. Generally, it's some sort of change that we would like to see taking place in our society. Working together, see this one here, leaders and followers who work together to accomplish a goal or some type of action, and the interaction is based upon some type of influence. So here we're talking about the relationship. So the focal point has gone from one person controlling other people to people working together to looking at the nature of the relationship that we have with each other in that type of behavior definition that we're looking at. All right. So in our modern view of things, we are looking at how we've ended up with some of these definitions that came up, or views that we've come up. And generally, over time, academics has led to the development of this more broad concept of the relational aspect of leadership, especially when we started to use, and we talked about this in the first chapter, about the impact of anthropology, sociology, psychology, history, and philosophy as they started to take aim at leadership. They would have an influence on developing the study of it, and of course the definitions of these things that were taking place. So today we know, therefore, that there is no one correct definition of leadership, because leadership evolves based upon circumstances and people. So different contexts requires different types of leadership, and that means that the way in which it might be defined will be different to others. So if we think about leadership in an organization, such as a business, then we might see it as more motivational in that sense. But if we see it in the form of like social media, it might be one of influence and peer pressure. So different contexts will give you different types of leadership definitions based upon what we're looking at or what we see. Okay. All right. So the thing from these early writings and musings about things, it gives rise to the concept of trying to find some sort of metaphorical definition of leadership. So basically, what we're trying to say is we want to make leadership a little more understandable. So one of the best ways that we can do that, or the easiest ways, is to compare leadership to something that we understand already. So you have these particular metaphors, the collective market, sorry, competitive market, the administrative metaphor, the collective bargaining metaphor, the democratic metaphor, the consensus building metaphor, anarchy metaphor, the independent judiciary metaphor, the plebiscitary autocratic metaphor. Oh, good devil. I always have problems with that. So these are different metaphors that were used to try and simplify the concept of leadership and work through its definition. So the one that the text tends to focus on is the metaphoric, um, the metaphor of an orchestra or symphony. So basically, what they're looking at is they're looking at this circumstance and they're looking at the conductor who's standing in the middle here, who is conducting the entire orchestra, and they're referring to him as this is leadership, this is the leader, and this is leadership in action. So what's happening there? So the idea is let's break it down a little smaller and use the metaphor of a jazz musician. So in a jazz musician situation, jazz band leaders have to do a number of things. They have to choose the music, find the musicians, develop the performance for public. They also have to look at the environment in which they're performing. There's things like the sound system, the room acoustics, the sound engineering, all those types of things have to come into play. Finding people to volunteer to play in the band, motivating people to perform to their very best, but to their very best within the context of working together. So everybody is codependent on each other to be able to get the very best out of it. And Dupree actually looked at this as probably one of the best metaphors to look at how leadership really operates in the real world around us. Anybody here has a musical background or performs in a band or plays an instrument? Show of hands might be nice. Nobody? Unbelievable. Oh, Jacob. So what do you perform? What do you do in the band, Jacob? Okay, I see your microphone's open, but we're not hearing you. Still not hearing you. Huh. All right, so maybe you need to check your microphone and see if it's hooked up properly. Really like to hear your contribution. So because you're the only person that has indicated that you have some sort of performance or musical background. But would other people still not hearing you, Jacob? I need to leave and come back. That might help. I don't know if you could reinitialize. So nobody else has any kind of background like that? It doesn't have to be music. It could be other kinds of performance that you get involved with. Yeah, Nima?
My master.
Naima, sorry. What do you?
I was an Indian dancer for a
Okay.
while.
Okay, that's cool. Um, and that also requires that you have a leader who's trying to get everybody to work together to bring out the best. So were you a
Yeah,
lead?
yeah.
Were you a lead dancer or were you a
Well, I mean,
secondary?
as I got older, I climbed the ranks.
All right, so you went into a lead position. All right, very good. So experience led you into
Yeah.
leadership positions in the organization. You can understand if you're trying to get your, what do you call it, your troupe, your dance troupe, to do a performance, it requires everybody working together to get the best out of everybody, choosing the music, trying to get your practice sessions sorted out, making sure you have your costumes and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yes, it's very hectic. I had some teaching experience in the field too, so
Right. So it always takes a lot of effort to
a
get
lot.
these things done. All right. So, and this is just a picture that is showing us in this circumstance, who's the likely leader in this ensemble that we're seeing here? Who do you think might be like it could be any one of them actually, but the one that strikes me as being most critical is the drummer, because the drummer is setting the pace for everybody to follow. So from a musical point of view, the drummer is kind of leading the way. But generally, when you start to work in groups, it is the person with the biggest ego that tends to want to be the leader. Having worked in groups myself, that has been a situation that I've found myself having to deal with in the past. So the person in the band with the largest ego, the biggest ego, is the one who tends to be the person that they're looking at influencing the most, but they may not actually end up being the leader because they lack the ability to be able to encourage other people to meet them along that way. All right. So that whole jazz band situation metaphor is something that they utilize because it it illustrates the inclusiveness required, valuing individuality, showing the importance of the public good because whatever you're doing for the public, empowering people to realize their gifts and talents. Those are things that are important as a leader in something like a band to be able to try and bring out the best for them. Because at the end of the day, you're setting up a performance for the benefit of an audience, and that audience needs to enjoy the show. They're not going to be familiar with all the pressure that you had to get things done. At the end of the day, they just want to have fun, especially if they're paying to come and see the show. All right, they're not concerned that you have to go quite down south to buy bits and pieces for your costumes and all that kind of stuff, right, Ms. Rahman? They just want to know that when you performed, it looked good, it sounded good, and everybody enjoyed it at the end of the day. All right,
Very true.
right. So Ross actually starts to talk about another metaphor for leadership as episodic. Episodic meaning that leadership is not something that happens every minute of every day. So even if you're in a leadership position, it is not something that is going to be taking place every every time you interact with people around you. Leadership is episodic. It's time specific, place specific, and context specific. So if you're running a meeting, all right, then at that point in time, while you're running the meeting, you're acting in a leadership perspective. But if you're just liming and having drinks, no, you know, you're not in a leadership context. Um, if you're sitting in an office and doing some work on something else, if you're working on your own elements of activities that you have to work on, that's not leadership. So Ross is speaking about the whole thing is that people perceive leadership as something that's taking place all the time. This is the leader, therefore they should be leading all the time. No, that's not the case. Leadership is done a little bit here, a little bit there, and so on. It's dependent upon the context that you're going to find. Not every minute of every day are you going to be operating as a leader. You're a leader maybe 10 to 15 minutes out of most of your day. Everything else is just run-of-the-mill normal behavior. So that's something you could also think about from that metaphor, that leadership is something that happens a little at a time, over time. Okay. Leadership is complex and elusive. Yes, we understand that. The multidisciplinary approach to understanding it, if we view psychology, sociology, anthropology, we've looked at history, we're going to be looking at the arts, we're going to be looking at all different types of techniques to be able to understand this. And leadership was the most success actually started to happen when we started to examine leadership from a social and behavioral standpoint. And that the complexity actually shows itself up there because you are combining the study of individuals and societies and how they work with each other to understand the context of leadership in those contexts. So therefore, what initially started was very simplistic studies or concepts about what leadership was all about, and then it moved to a very complex phenomenon that we're going to look at today. And that takes us to now the theories that we're going to look at or that have been developed over time in terms of the various theories that we're going to be looking at in terms of how they were developed. So starting with the great man and going all the way up to the chaos theories and the influence theories. All right, so we're going to be going into looking at all of these approaches in a chronological order, basically. So the first set of theories that existed was the great man approach. And this is basically developed under the Darwinistic thinking, which was popular in the first part of the 19th century. So this is coming out in the 1800s when Darwin started to postulate his whole concept of survival of the fittest and the evolution of man. Those things impacted heavily on the thinking process about leadership because they started to apply that approach. So in essence, what they're talking about is the great man folklore is based upon these people who genetically emerged in society as leaders. And what we could look at here now is the emergence of kings, in particular kings, because again, from their point of view at that particular time frame, leadership was the domain of men. And it meant that these men genetically passed on their traits from one person to another. So their children were the next in line, so to speak. So we actually can see that in the process of looking at the change in leadership that is taking place in the British Empire right now, that is taking place with the changeover from the mother to the son in relation to that. But interestingly enough, here we're talking about a mother to a son, but the old theory, the great man theory, was exactly that. They would only consider men to be leaders and women to be not important. So wherever there was the emergence of great women leaders in the past, they just ignored those as being unnaturals. Okay, so people like Joan of Arc, Catherine the Great, and of course, well, if this theory is still in existence or still held weight in the thinking process, they would have also had to ignore Queen Elizabeth I as well as Queen Elizabeth II. So all of those things. But again, we have to think about the context in which this was developed. This was developed back in a time frame where Darwinist thinking of survival of the fittest was really the forefront of scientific thought back then. All right, so that led to something called the trait approaches. So this is the early 1900s now. The great man theory gave way to the trait theory. So the trait theory says that there was a combination of traits that would exist in an individual who would set them aside as being leaders. And those traits or characteristics would be seen quite easily. All right, so now we have to start to think about, so in what context are we talking about this? So in this time frame, the early 1900s, so that's coming out of 1850 onwards, you have to remember you had the Darwinist thinking that came up before. And Darwinist thinking focused its attention on something called eugenics. So eugenics is this concept that there are particular types of genes that are responsible for the development of a particular type of individual. So leaders were supposed to have come from particular types of people or races of individuals, so that the eugenics of the time frame started to speak to leadership emerging from those in our society who came from a particular group of individuals. Um, and this was across both United States and Europe. This thinking was very, very, well, so to speak, cutting edge at the time. But of course, it meant that on the downside, it meant that the vast majority of other individuals who existed in society were not going to be leaders and were supposed to be um, subordinate to those people who were the leaders. Now, this is one of the arguments that was put together to justify slavery. So we have to think about that in the context of where this theory emerged. So the problem with this theory, however, is that it made these assumptions about the traits. So they talked about the level of intelligence, their height, their self-confidence. The textbook didn't actually want to mention things like they had to be white, they had to be male, they had to have blue eyes, they had to have blonde hair, they must come from a known genetic background of individuals from particular parts of the world. So that those things weren't discussed, but if you go reading about eugenics and the whole concept of eugenics, that was also very popular going into World War II. You'd realize that this trend of thought was very damaging. All right. Research, however, that was conducted in this trait theory failed to produce an actual list of traits that ensured that people with these characteristics will be good leaders or effective leaders. So there's a disconnect between what the theory said and what the practice was. So thank God that eventually ruled out, although we still live with the impact of holding those things. That then led to the development of the behavioral approaches. So the behavioral approaches started to switch focus on looking for, instead of looking at traits now, we started to look at behaviors and what are the observable behaviors of people who operate in management positions. And this was primarily in managerial positions in industry. So we had the ability at that point in time to compare the behaviors of effective and ineffective leaders as seen through some sort of measuring stick in terms of influence or outcome, I should say. And this field utilized psychology to try and look at the behaviors of individuals. And it was primarily after World War II in the 50s and 60s. Now we have to think about what's going on in the world in the 50s and 60s, where there is a reconstruction taking place throughout the world after World War II, because there was a lot of destruction. The vast majority of production is taking place in the United States, and the United States is producing for the world. And it is using a process of industrialized and factory setups. So we have to think about that. So when they're talking about measuring the behavior, observing the behavior of successful or effective leaders, what they're looking at are leaders operating in industries. Primarily, if this is where you had the development of division of labor and specialization in labor and so on. That type of activities help to generate the mass production of goods and services that was taking place across the world at that particular point in time. So what they would do is basically go into these places of business and observe what was taking place by noting the types of behaviors. And they eventually started to look at different models, started to develop these types of behaviors and start to give them names. So this one from Ohio State and the University of Michigan, they produced 2 dimensions of behaviors, considering behaviors and initiating structures. So basically, consideration was the degree to which the leader acted friendly and supportive towards the subordinates in his staff. All right, showed concern for subordinates and looked out for their welfare. So these were how they defined the behavior. And initiating is the degree to which the leader defines and structures his or her own role and the roles of subordinates towards getting the group's formal goals achieved. So this is basically anything that they looked at the manager doing that was to the benefit of the worker was seen as considering, and initiating structure was any behaviors that they were looking at that were going to move the goals of the organization forward. That's production, basically. So these 2 elements were observed, measured, and they were seen as being independent of each other. So you can have scores high between both of them. And they tried to make a correlation now between those people who behaved in one particular way and whether or not what kind of impact they had in terms of being effective, not effective, and trying to make some sort of observational approaches to the whole thing. Now, another model, the Blake and Wooten, proposed 2 different, same thing basically, concern for people, concern for production. So you can see the similarity there between the initiating structure and the, what's the other one? Consideration. So concern for people and concern for production has to do the same thing. The behaviors that indicated the manager showing concern for people as opposed to the behaviors that was really focused on production. So basically they were looking at how much activities that the managers, effective managers, um, you know, time they spent dealing with people as opposed to production, those kind of things. And then they tried to make observations there to see whether or not there was some sort of correlation between that type of behavior and whether or not the person was seen as effective or not. Now, the Michigan study, they developed 3 types of behaviors that they were looking at: task-oriented behaviors, relationship-oriented, and again, you could start to see that whole thing coming up. Task-oriented would be those things that are engaged for production purposes. Relationship would be those that are behaviors that are looking towards the welfare of the worker. And participative leadership is a type of behavior that would be looking at their inclusiveness and decision-making processes that were taking place at that time. Here you talk about the 50s and 60s, guys. So we have to think about what's happening there. Now, what happened? Basically, they couldn't make the kind of correlations that they were hoping to make. They couldn't make these types of observations and get to some sort of definitive statement as to whether or not any one behavior or other would in fact make sense. So at the end of the day, the research proved to be inconclusive and inconsistent. And this is also where they started to realize that, okay, so they were focusing only on the leader's behavior, but ignored the circumstances in which this behavior was taking place. So that is one of the things that led to the development of the next set of things, which was situational contingency approaches. So this one now was looking at the leader's behaviors, and they were also trying to factor in the situations that they found themselves operating in. And that was something that they had to pay attention to. Now, so that means you're gone from one extreme where you're only focused on the behavior of the manager. Now you're going on to focus on the context in which you're going to. That's the other extreme. So what they were looking at was how these situations affected the behaviors of leaders and how did it affect their their efficiency in getting things done. So contingency theory incorporated situational moderated variables to explain leadership effectiveness. Emphasize that leadership behavior cannot be explained in a vacuum and elements of the situation must be included. So again, the behaviors will still be observed, but they also have to observe in what context was this taking place. All right. These are the main theories. The first, least preferred worker LPC model. That was developed in the mid-60s, which described how the situation moderates the relationship between the leader's traits and its effectiveness. So what we're looking at here now is the situation now has an impact on the relationship between the leader and their effectiveness. Exactly what they're talking about, that least preferred co-worker. Then you had the path goal theory, which originated in 57. And this theory was one where they were looking at if the manager did things that, all right, so to attain personal goals, they found that productivity was highest among people who saw that their personal goals were being accomplished if they were aligned with the production goals. So that in order for a leader to get to be effective, they had to make sure that the personal goals of their workers had to be aligned closely to the performance objectives of the organization, so that you can get the best output from that. So basically, kind of like starting the whole process of motivational theory and motivational thinking. If you want people to do well, then you have to motivate them with some sort of extrinsic um, extrinsic reward structure, money, promotions, increased hours of work, that kind of stuff. Those kind of things that were coming up in terms of these types of models that were coming up in the early 50s. Now, I want you all to think about the context in which these observations were taking place. So they would tell you, they would come to your factory and they'll be dressed in lab coats and they'd have these clip charts or clipboards, and they'll be standing there and they'll be making observations. So they'll be making notes and doing check marks and starting to make these observations about circumstances, about your actions and behaviors. And we know, for anybody who studied psychology or sociology, once somebody is being observed by anybody else, your behavior changes. And that therefore started to influence the way in which the information was being gathered. For you to be able to collect information in a true sense, you actually have to conceal the fact that you're measuring somebody's behavior. Because once people know they're being observed, they are going to change their behavior. And that's the truth. The truth of the matter, that is what always happens. So obviously, these kind of observational techniques that they were utilizing wasn't being effective because they were just, trying to highlight these things. So concerns about these theories: lack of supporting research, unclear relationships between the commitment and competence of subordinates and their levels of development. So there was a whole host of different problems coming up. So here we're talking about going up to the 1960s now. There's something happening in the 1960s, which then takes us to these influence theories. So influence theories use the term where they're talking about how clearly is the leader able to influence people is going to be based upon charisma. Now, so Max Weber or Weber, depending upon where you want to pronounce it, but it's generally pronounced Weber. All right, 1924, 1947, you'd see again, this is associated around the emergence of people like Adolf Hitler, who were very charismatic in their rise to fame and, well, infamy as well. So the context in which some of the studies take place started back in this time frame and then continued on into the 1970s, where charismatic leadership was formalized there. Again, the problem with charismatic leadership is that the variables that you're trying to evaluate are not easily seen and therefore can't be measured, because the concept of charisma is not anything that is easily definable. So it kind of harks back to trait theory. Would people with these particular traits be more charismatic? If you're well spoken, if you're pleasant to look at, um, is your language usage common with everybody around you? What gives one person more charisma than another? And generally has a lot to do with the level of confidence that the individual exhibits. And is that something that can be objectively measured? And that is problematic. So again, influence theories suffered from that inability to be able to be truly measured. All right. And of course, the problem that always came up was the the charisma is not so much about the leader, but about how followers respond to people that they perceive as having good charisma. And that is part of a problem, because again, if leaders are unable to hold back their or subdue their basic instincts in life, they can lead people to do really bad things. Several theories existed, and of the time frames in which charismatic leaders tended to come to the forefront was always going to be when there was some sort of social upheaval taking place in the society around you. And they are actually in a situation where they rise in situations where there's a lot of popular opinion to change the current method of thinking. So all you're really looking for is a spokesperson who's willing to walk that line with you and help define that change during that period of time. So this is what they talked about, that the effectiveness of charismatic leaders has a lot to do with the framework in which, or the circumstances in which they're operating, needs to be a position or a time frame of crisis, and when people are willing to make change, which is to challenge the status quo. So those are things that they start to make some sort of connection between them. And the problem that always comes up with charismatic leadership is if you defer to the leader's opinions and attitudes and their particular ideas, it can be problematic, because if they have a very what's the word I want to use? If they have a fairly warped idea of what their reality or what their dreams are, then it can lead to some very dangerous outcomes. And we have a host of them throughout history, not just the ones I spoke about, but there's a whole host of these people that have taken people through all sorts of situations, and they've ended up in very negative circumstances as well. You all might be familiar with the Branch Davidian. Anybody's familiar with that? David Koresh in the Waco, Texas. He's one. You have some of the Moonies. You have there's some with some very strange names as well. Sect of people who believe that, and most of them tend to be they tend to think through the process of the world is coming to an end, and therefore we have to be prepared for it, and it's kind of end the world kind of nonsense that goes on. That is potentially extremely dangerous for us. And there are a couple of them that like Scientology is one that comes up as ever so often as a discussion of it being a cult as well. So anybody's familiar with Scientology, right? So, we have some very big name Scientologists in our societies around us. Tom Cruise is one, John Travolta, whole host of actors who have gotten involved with that. You're familiar with those things, right? No, not okay. Do some reading and do some research on it, guys. All right. That then led us to reciprocal leadership theories that started its development in the early 70s. Now, what's happening in the 70s, the late 60s and the 70s? Anybody? What's happening from a cultural point of view? A couple of things. We have lots of drugs being used. There's a war being fought that is not very popular in Vietnam. And it starts to bring on a very international flavor. You have a movement of peace and flower power and love will solve everything kind of simplistic approach to things. That was very popular coming out of the 60s into the 70s. So you had a lot of recreational drug use, you had a lot of hippies, flower power. You also had the development of, and this is interesting, of female um, contraception, the development of the pill that actually is something that impacted upon the behavior of people during that particular time frame as well. So the 70s, in the context of the 70s, the reciprocal leadership theories developed. Um, it focused on the relationship between the leaders and the followers. And so it started to emphasize the need for us to look at how we mutually achieve things through working together. Now, something else that was happening in the latter part of the 70s, mid 70s, was also the influx of different um, cultures into Western culture. Primarily, you had an influx of Eastern culture and Eastern thinking, as some of these musicians and the individuals who were influencers at the time in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, starting to experiment with Hinduism, with Buddhism, with Eastern culture, and started to bring some of the concepts that existed there coming back into their behaviors and thinking in the West. So this is where you started to see a sort of cultural exchange taking place between that period and the others. So in the context of that, you have these kind of reciprocal leadership theories developing where you're not working on your own. You're dependent upon a reciprocal behaviors between leaders and followers, and that actually started to develop these particular theories. So leadership is not about what the leader does to followers, but rather leadership is a process that meaningfully engages leaders and participants, values the contributions of everybody, shares power, shares authority between leaders and participants, and establishes leadership as an inclusive activity among interdependent people. So we're all working together to to develop some sort of change, positive change in our society. And this is where this kind of influence of we are all together working towards transforming our society into a better place. So these are some of the leaders, the theories that developed during this period: the transforming leadership theory, the servant leadership theory, and the followership theory. We're going to utilize all of these theories in our discussions here moving forward, because a lot of the findings from this paid a lot of attention to one key element that was across all of them, and that was one, this is about a relationship between people. Two, ethical values started to become very important. And we have to understand why. In the 70s, a great amount of distrust started to develop between the younger population that existed and the leadership that came from the previous age group. So you had this what Pink Floyd called the wall, which is the generational gap that existed between the people who were born in the 50s and 60s to those people who were born in the 70s, the late 60s and 70s. That generational gap, which is referred to as the wall in Pink Floyd, if you're familiar, Pink Floyd is a band that created an album called The Wall. and they featured a song about that. You know that song, "We Don't Need No Education." If you know that song, that's speaking to that generational gap that existed, and they refer to it as the wall. So these theories here really started to focus on the fact that there was this big disconnect between the leadership that existed as a result of the age difference and what people of that particular young age felt was going wrong in society. So there was a huge disconnect, and therefore they felt as if what they were saying and what they were doing were two different things. So there was an ethical issue that they were facing that they moved in. So the transformational leadership theories, 1978, um, process where leaders and followers raise one another to higher levels of morality and motivation. So again, see that whole thing of ethics coming to bear. Um, and it's focused on the relationship between the two. And they're talking about appealing to each other to deal with higher ideals and moral values such as liberty, justice, equality, peace, humanitarianism, being ecologically sensitive and so on, and not to lesser emotions such as fear, greed, jealousy, and hate. And interestingly enough, we seem to have kind of come full circle, because if we look at the nature of elections coming out in the American experience in the last elections, where we had Trump coming up as president, a lot of the reasons why people voted the way they did was out of fear and out of hatred, and of course some level of greed. So we seem to be cycling backwards again in going through these particular types of things again, because probably the nature of the leaders who are stepping up aren't necessarily the people who ought to be leading us in this time of our lives. So that transformational leadership also spoke to the inability to separate followers from leaders, because you can't be a leader without followers. And that kind of like is the same thing. You can't be a leader without followers, and followers can't be, working on anything without leaders. So there's this symbiotic relationship between both. And it was important that we work with each other to be able to get it. So again, this whole leader-follower relationship thing is examined in this theory. Let's get to the servant leadership. So these are some people out that were identified as transformational leaders. And the interesting thing, 4 out of the 6 of these guys were assassinated because they were all moving their societies, transforming their societies away from something that was not viewed as being good. So with the exception of Mother Teresa and FDR, the other 4 were assassinated for transforming this or attempting to transform their societies from one type of behavior into another. It's interesting. But each one of these represents an individual whose life was devoted to transforming their their country or their people around them into thinking differently about the circumstances that they found themselves in. Quite interesting that transformational leaders can in fact lead to a negative end or a violent end because you're challenging the status quo. All right, so transformational leadership is often contrasted with transactional leadership. So transactional leadership is leadership using the promise of gain. So if you do this, you will get this. But if you don't do this, you will either not get this or you will get something else. So it's sort of like negative and positive reinforcement, which is what transactional leadership is about. So most firms and organizations operate on transactional. You do your work, you get paid. You don't do your work, you get docked. That kind of stuff. That type of leadership practice is something that leaders can utilize. And the fact of the matter is that we will recognize that as just one transformational leadership and transactional leadership are just two different techniques of leadership that can be utilized in the long run. At least that's where we want to come from. But our whole concept of transactional leadership is along the lines of the carrot and the stick. You either get the stick or you get the carrot. Either you get what I'm enticing you with for motivational purposes, or I punish you with the stick. Which one would you prefer? All right, so the servant leadership theory speaks to the leader being the servant of the followers. And the function of the servant is to be able to prepare my followers to replace me, transform you into a leader. So the purpose of the leader is to function as a servant to the followers to be able to lead them to becoming leaders themselves. All right. So that's why it's referred to as a servant leadership. You will deal with this in more detail when you look at the chapter on power and influence as well. It treats with this area here. But again, it's about developing a change in perception in terms of as a leader, you're not there to lord over people, but to serve them for them to realize their leadership potential. That is basically the whole concept. So, but it is not only about serving the individuals within the organization, but also your behavior is to serve the greater good of society as well. So you're not only serving the needs of the people in your organization for them to be able to become better leaders, but also that we are ensuring that whatever we are doing, we're doing for the best, to the best of our ability, and for the betterment of our society. So again, high levels of ideals and ethical values being put into this situation. So that's the genesis or the major setup for that. The next one is the followership theory, which is again has to do with the same thing. In the followership theory, they really start to flip the focus on, rather than looking at the leader only, but we're looking at the followers that people have in their organization. And that leaders are not superior to followers, but they have a symbiotic relationship in which leaders are there to facilitate followers to become leaders themselves. So it's important that in this case here, it kind of speaks to that same servant model kind of thing. And of course, you have different types of followers that we identified before. And we talked about the alienated followers, the sheep, the yes people. So the concept is to be able to create as many effective followers out of the group of individuals that you find yourself surrounded with, so that they are able to think independently and critically and get themselves involved with the daily practice of what's going on. So this followership theory really focuses on what you're going to be able to do. So we expect that the followers can manage themselves well. They're committed to the organization, to the purpose principles. They are able to build their competencies and focus on doing their best. They're courageous, honest, and credible. So again, a focus here on ethical values. Um, the leader and the followers are looked at as co-adventures. I remember used the concept of associates working in an organization together. And effective followers need to be empowered. So my job as a leader would be to empower my followers to be able to do the job better than me, and even be able to take the organization further than I can even perceive it going. So those theories, they describe leadership. Um, the so most of the theories, if I go back a little bit, most of the theories that we were looking at comes out of the industrial paradigm. So even though we're talking about the 60s and 70s, we're talking about the same paradigm of looking at organizations in the industrial context. And the fact of the matter is that that paradigm has changed. So in the 20th century, we've moved away from that industrial era, and the theories have to adjust Because if the theories just stayed where they were there, they were still looking at management-oriented contexts, where they also tended to be more male-oriented, very rational, technocratic, linear, quantitative, all these descriptors that Ross put together here in terms of the paradigm in which these theories emerged in terms of leadership thinking. So we have to realize that the context in which these leadership models were developed was in that industrial context. So it means that newer theories or contemporary theories have to adjust to a changing paradigm that exists in the world and our cultures around us. So total transformation, the reciprocal theories have allowed the ability for us to walk away from that industrial background and shift into a non-industrial or post-industrial paradigm. Here we have a situation where there's a less divide between subordinates and managers. In fact, modern organizations don't use that term, they use associates. Most organizations use teams where there may or may not be a team lead or team lead that rotates through different individuals in the organization. Now, whether or not that is contextually correct in Trinidad and Tobago or in the Caribbean region, I can't say, but I don't think a lot of organizations here approach leadership from outside of that industrialized, at least heavily influenced by that industrial context. But more and more organizations realize that it's necessary to update this leadership theory because we have to think about leadership in that context. We can't think about leadership, and this is one of the reasons why online teaching is going to move us into that environment as well, because you're not in these silos, you're not in these seats where you're sitting down and looking at a board. You're doing lots of different things in the classroom that are different to what is going on in a traditional classroom. So the movement away from that post-industrial thinking process in the education system is one that's going to help move us through these more contemporary type of relational models. And in fact, it proves itself over and over again. Those classes that you have the best relationships with your lecturers are the ones that you're going to do well in. The ones in which you have a very distant and very formal or stiff type of relationship with, you're not necessarily going to do your very best there. At least that's the practice that I have seen in the past. So this changing concepts that's facing us here also has to take into consideration that we are living in a time frame where there has been massive changes in every aspect of our lives. Economic change, technological change, socio-political, moral, ethical. We've had just so much change hit us in such a short space of time that we have to adjust our thinking. Yes, Jacob.
I
Fine,
have
fine.
I need
Yeah,
to
go.
have to leave class early.
No worries.
Okay, thank you, sir.
No problem. See you later. Just look at the recording, I guess. Catch up on what you missed because we're going to wrap up in a little bit in any case. All right. So obviously, if the world is changing as fast as it is and is going to be evolving the way it's evolving now, we have to have a model that will encompass that type of change environment. So it's important for us to look at what's going on. So one of the things that I found really interesting is that a lot of what we were taught in school depends upon a world in which everything is nice and neat and controlled. All right. Now, this might start to affect some of you all negatively, because that then starts to take us into chaos theory. But the world is no longer this nice, neat, orderly place, though we may like it. How many of you all here think you have some form of OCD? It tends to affect women more than men. Let's start with that. And people in science backgrounds also tend to be more OCD in nature. So, whose garden does that fall into? Miss Lalchan? Oh, the Lalchans? Right, nobody want to answer me.
Oh my God, sir. I'm not really I have more anxiety than OCD.
All right. But you understand what I mean by OCD, right? All right. So if you're operating in a world that's messy, then obviously a lot of the things that we were taught in school can't apply to what we're talking about here. Because if you remember when you were in primary school and you were in secondary school, everything had to be nice, neat, and orderly in order to have things for you to learn. So learning in a messy environment. So if you think about your learning techniques, if you're learning, you want your learning environment to be relatively neat and tidy. So the problem that you're going to face here, though, is that we no longer live in a world like that. We're living in a world that's just full of chaos. And that chaos means that we have to learn different techniques now to deal with that particular situation. We have to be able to navigate the world in a that is making massive change in short spaces of time. So some of the techniques that they talk about here in terms of chaos is dealing with the chaos by being able to accept the fact that change is inevitable. And that even though it may appear to be chaotic, that there is patterns of behaviors that are taking place, or patterns of activities that are taking place that because they're happening so quickly, we're probably not able to observe them. That's one thing that they talk about. But in that technique of the chaotic world, what is important is for us to remain connected with the people around us. Again, in the connected world, we're required to maintain good relationships because it is the relationships that we make and we hold that will help us to navigate our way through this chaotic place. So a couple of things that they keep on talking about in terms of the chaos theory is that you need to know what is causing the initial condition. All right. The initial condition is the change that is taking place because where something starts is going to determine where it's going to end. So this is why you have to pay attention to that. The second element is that we have to be looking at the important connections. The text or the system refers to this as anness, to be aware of the fact that these connections of anness have to be realized and noted because we are literally going to have to and with other people or other systems to be able to make a decision. So unless you and something else or someone else, you can't do anything. So you're going to be, it further defines the interrelated nature of having to work with other people. So you have that, the paying attention to the initial conditions, paying attention to the concept of andness and the ability to and with other folks, all right? Then we have the situation here of systematic thinking that leads us to both and or, right? So systematic leadership is both and, not either or, meaning that you can be right and wrong simultaneously. Something is not right or wrong. It might be right and wrong because it can be partially correct and partially incorrect. All right, so this might sound a bit confusing. So this is the other element. With the anding, what you're going to find is that solutions will not come up that are not perfectly correct, or they're going to be partially correct and partially incorrect. But you're going to take that which is partially correct and add it to another partially correct solution and possibly come up with a better solution than if you just used one. So that's what they were talking about here. So again, it means taking the positive from one particular suggestion and combining it with, again, ending it with another solution from a different perspective or different point of view or different idea, and bringing them together to end it, to be able to find a better solution to a problem that you're facing. You're not going to find the perfect situation or the perfect solution, because the perfect solution may not exist. All right. So if you're trying to solve a problem, the tendency will be to look for a single answer. But because of the various perspectives, a better idea is to look for multiple partial solutions. You'll be more likely to come up with something if you are using more than one approach to looking at the problem. And that has to do with, again, acceptance of more people, more point of view. So it's all about that relationship we're developing. So that chaos system, that's what they're looking at there. All right. So the problems that come up within our groups now are not simple. They're not simple things. And it means that we have complex issues that require complex solutions. And these complex problems require probably partial solutions coming from different aspects of the organization that you're working with, or the community that you're working with. Not everybody would have one solution. So, because again, if we think about any one problem that we have and we try to use any one solution that comes from only one group of individuals, we're not capable, or we're not looking at the problem from a perspective of somebody else who might be influenced or affected by that same problem or solution in a different manner. So that's something that we always have to pay attention to. The problems are complicated, and these complicated problems don't have one solution. They have a number of solutions. So we have to stop looking at, think about this from a mathematical point of view. We have to stop looking at there's only one right answer. There are variable answers to the problems that we're facing. This is not necessarily a math issue. It's and even math lecturers will tell you there's not one way to find a solution to a problem. Some math lecturers who understand their mathematics better, they will tell you that there's more than one way to fix the problems that we face around us, even our mathematical issues. All right, so this is this chaos system that they develop. So again, the big concern here, it sounds nebulous meaning it's vague. But if we think about how our peer group shapes and the behaviors of its participants, or the impact that it has on the culture, you'd start to think about, it should indicate to you that the way in which these things are done is kind of like how we live our lives. There's no one answer to things. Try not to underestimate the influence that other participants have in organization with each other. So which means don't marginalize people. And people will always find a way to organize themselves. So these are the kind of things that come up in this chaos system that we're talking about. Now, the last method or system that we talk about here is the development of one of the more recent theories, and this is going to be important, is about authentic leadership. And this speaks to leaders being authentic. And it means that leadership that is authentic is emphasizing the need for leaders to be their true selves and not lie about who they are or construct some version of themselves that they present to the population that is based only on the positive aspects of your life. You are the sum total of all your behaviors and all your life, all your actions. So it's important for you to present that element or that true self or your true self to everybody. So what are the characteristics? Authentic leaderships have positive psychology. They're transformational leaders. They are moral, ethical people. Authentic leaders are often people that are considered to be confident, hopeful, optimistic, resilient, transparent. future-oriented, and give priority to developing others, right? Developing associates to be leaders. Those are the characteristics, but the most critical one is that they are truly who they say they are. They're not a version of what they say they are. All right. This is difficult to do because there are parts of ourselves that we prefer to hold away from society. And sometimes our societies are not ready for the truths that people have to say about themselves, especially if their true selves are not in line with your positions in life. So, for example, does it mean that somebody who has an alternative lifestyle can't be an authentic leader? Well, the only thing that the only problem they're going to have is if people who are around them are not tolerant of that authentic of that alternative lifestyle. If they would have that problem, it doesn't mean that this person is not authentic, but he may not be able to work with those individuals who view that as being something negative. But everybody is made up of a combination of positive and negative aspects of their lives. Nobody is, well, basically without sin, if you want to think about it from that sense. All right. And therefore, the idea is, are you willing to put yourself online for that? So that's primarily what this whole concept is, that the authentic leadership model is really going to be focused on us being our authentic selves when we're engaging in leadership activities. And only if we are that way can we really expect to inspire people to want to be leaders as well. So, and that's hard to be authentic sometimes in a context where people are very distrusting of people because of leaders in particular, because of past behaviors. I know, for instance, I am very suspicious of people in leadership positions in certain aspects of my life because of what took place with them in the past, and with not necessarily with them, but with other people in similar positions. So I am judging them based upon my preconceived notions of how others have behaved in the context of those things. And I know it's something that I have to work on, but it's something that I have to give that individual an opportunity to show themselves to be different. And that's important, because then I'm not allowing them the opportunity to be an authentic leader, because I am taking that away from them. But it's part and parcel of the problems that I have to deal with as a follower in organizations other than where I have to work. All right. So again, these are some of the characteristics of leaders and followers: transparency, openness, trust. See that one, that I have that problem with that trust issue. Guidance towards worthy objectives, don't have a problem with that. And emphasis on follower development, don't have a problem with that. But my biggest issue is really trust, because I think in the past I've seen things be not be trustworthy. All right. Okay, so everybody kind of gets the idea of what this whole authentic model is all about. So, all right, so check this out. Authentic leaders do not fake their leadership. Relatedly, authentic leaders do not take on a leadership role or engage in leadership activities for status, honor, or other personal rewards. Authentic leaders are original, they're not copies. Authentic leaders are leaders whose actions are based on their values and convictions. It's important to remember that authentic leaders can be directive or participative, and could even be authoritative, sorry. The behavioral style per se is not what necessarily differentiates the authentic leader from the inauthentic leader. So the style of leadership is not in question here, but it is whether or not the person is authentic. That is the critical value here that they're talking about. So these are the things that we keep on talking about in terms of authentic leadership. This is probably one of the latest models that was developed And to me, this is an offering based upon a lot of the nonsense that took place in the latter part of 2008, 9, and 10, 2010, where we had all these ethical issues come up with large organizations. It proves that there's a need for authenticity with our leadership. So in summary, what we looked at so far in this chapter was we looked at the emergence of the phenomenon of leadership as a studied phenomenon. And we looked at the definition, how it was defined over the periods that we looked at. We also observed how the conditions have changed over time in terms of how we've gone about studying them, the emergence of various theories over time frames. And then we've looked at this last model here, the authentic leadership. So we really paid attention to the development or the historical or chronological development of leadership over time. Now, it may mean that some people still hold different models in more esteem than others because newer models take time to emerge into being trustworthy and acceptable. In the next chapter, we are going to be looking at the relational leadership model in more detail. That's what chapter 3 is about. It's going to be it's a fairly long presentation as well, but I hope you get a chance to go through it so that this chronological historical thing allows for that. Okay, now I know I kind of went speeding through some of these things. Let's find out. Are there any questions that people want to ask, or is it relatively straightforward?
No questions.
You're good there. You understand everything?
So it was easy to follow.
Yeah, relative. All right. Anybody else?
It was
Question?
relatively easy to follow, but a lot to take in.
A lot to take in, yes. Because here you're talking about me going through the development of leadership studies from the 1300s to today, literally. So there's a lot in
Yeah,
our
yes.
history,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I would say what you can do is go back over the presentation on your own speed and kind of look at things and probably pay more attention to the concepts going forward that way. But we will want to move forward as quickly as we can to the relational model, which is the next chapter. But as long as I think you don't have to go and worry about memorizing this. That's the other thing. You're not going to get a test on this. This is primarily informational. It's as I said, it's not required that you memorize any of this information, but simply read it, ruminate on the ideas, and think about it. Look at the connections I made between what was going on at any particular time and its influence on the kind of theories that they were developed in that period. Because you have to remember that a lot of people don't think about this, but the development of behavioral theories in particular are sometimes very heavily influenced by the overall thought or concepts that are popular during a particular period of time. So you can see the influence that culture has on the development of these ideas and concepts. That makes sense?
So basically getting tested on the theories and the concepts of leadership and ethics. Is that it?
No, we're not getting tested on any of this. Did you see an exam anywhere?
No, but put it down now. I just wanted to know.
No. Again, for me, what I would like you to do is if you find any one of those concepts or ideas that I talked about in the context of any of these presentations, go and do your own readings on it. Go and do your own research on it. And out of curiosity, learn some more about it. Like I spoke about Scientology and I spoke about the Branch Davidians and all that kind of stuff as end of day cults. I mean, that might be something of interest for you to go and look at. I know because I spoke about those things in the past, especially when I spoke about Jim Jones, it led me into an exploration of a whole set of those particular types of cults that existed in the world around us. A lot of them are European, some of them American, and so on. And you know, understanding how is it that these cults can exist among what I would say educated individuals. How do educated people get caught up in that kind of stuff? I mean, why would they? How would they end up being caught up in something as in hindsight, silly as that? You know, that's something that I've always wondered about, and that led me into doing my own research in the areas. And today, the research is so easy to do. You understand? All right, guys. All right. So if there are no questions, I want to pause the recording